This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Can I just say this, Mark? I wish that I did not think what the hell is going on every single damn hour of every single damn day. Nonetheless, we have a podcast to do. What the hell is going on our podcast?
It's why it's the best named podcast in America, because it's literally what everybody's wondering all the time. So we were trying to figure out what the hell are the American people thinking about foreign policy. And the Reagan Institute has a new poll out, which really delves deep into where the American people are when it comes to foreign policy and focuses primarily on the biggest foreign policy immediate challenge that's happening right now, which is the war in Ukraine. But it also talks more broadly about American foreign policy. And one of the things it shows us is that Americans are, they are still in favor of a principled foreign policy. They're still in favor of human rights. They're still in favor of democracy, and they back Ukraine. There are caveats to that, but it's an encouraging poll about the way that Americans see the world.
So I love what our friends, and I'm proud to call them that, our friends have done at the Ronald Reagan Foundation, because Roger Zackheim, who heads it up, Rachel Hoff, the infamous Hoff, who used to work with us at AEI, and now Dave Trulio has just joined them, are people who truly believe in something. And we can talk about the numbers. We talk about the numbers with Roger. But one of the things that I really admire is that they ask the hard questions about values. And what I admire even more is that the American people answer, and values still matter a ton to them. Between our presidential candidates on the left, on the right, here, up, down, here, there, I despair. But the truth is that even though we've elevated people who suck to the top, the reality is that Americans actually care about the things they've always cared about. They care about freedom, they care about democracy, and they're not selfish. They don't just care about themselves.
Let me just give our listeners a few numbers here from the Reagan poll. They asked if you agree or disagree with the following statements about U.S. leadership and engagement in international events. U.S. leadership and engagement in international events is essential to promoting trade and boosting our economy. 76% agree. The U.S. should stand up for human rights and democracy wherever possible in international affairs. 74% agree. A strong U.S. military is essential to maintaining peace and prosperity both at home and abroad. 85% agree. Interestingly, the U.S. is better served by withdrawing from international affairs and focusing more attention on problems at home. 65% agree. That would seem to be contradictory to the rest of it, but I'm not sure it is, because Americans are reluctant internationalists. I think they need to be convinced when it comes to specific things, and they're really concerned about what's happening at home right now, because there's so many problems facing us, from inflation to the border to crime in our cities. But when it comes to these things, we're talking super majorities, 76%, 85%. Just a couple more. What are these things should be a major focus of U.S. foreign policy? Countering Chinese military power, 54%. Countering Russian military power, 49%. Pushing for nuclear disarmament, 53%. Protecting U.S. jobs and companies, 77%. Fighting terrorist networks, 70%. 58% fighting for favorable trade deals. They want us to lead in the world, not at the expense of what's happening at home, which I think they feel is happening right now. But how do we square that circle, Danny?
Well, but you know the answer, and you say this all the time, and you're always more optimistic about the next person who's going to come along than I am, but the answer is always leadership. That is what the Ronald Reagan Foundation is all about, because it's about the dissemination of the ideas that underpin that leadership. But you know what? It's not just that Americans are reluctant internationalists, it's that it takes so little to persuade Americans. You know, anti-Americanism is alive and well, and you and I, who work in foreign policy, spend a lot of time abroad as well as at home talking about these issues. And one thing that always strikes me, especially when I come to Europe, but also Asia, Australia, is the disdain, the contempt that people enjoy having for the American people. And my response is always the same, right? No one steps up when their lives aren't at stake, when their interests aren't at stake, like the American people. And that, I think one of the things that the polling reveals is not simply that that remains true, but that with a little leadership, with a little passion for the values that animated the founding of this country, those numbers would be in the 80s and 90s among Republicans and Democrats. Thank God for that.
Well, you know what's so fascinating is the other numbers here, which are so encouraging, is on Ukraine, a supermajority of 75% of Americans think it's important to the U.S. that Ukraine wins against Russian aggression, including 86% of Democrats and 71% of Republicans, and 60% support U.S. military aid to Ukraine. What I find fascinating about that number is that Americans instinctively understand that helping Ukraine is not only the right thing to do, it's in America's interests. And nobody's making that case to them. I mean, I am in the Washington Post. I did a whole essay on it. But, you know, people are not making that case.
But the president isn't.
No, that's my point. It's like, you know, when I wrote that essay in the Washington Post that we've talked about on the podcast, I showed it to my wife, and she said, this is the speech you would have written for George W. Bush. Because George W. Bush would have been giving a speech, you know, every week talking about.
Don't short sell yourself. You would have written that speech for Joe Biden as well if he were
if he
willing
asked
to
me
make
to,
it.
sure. But here's the broader point, and it's not just a Ukraine point, it's a foreign policy point, which is the American people are like an open door when it comes to arguments for why we should be engaged in the world. They are reluctant internationalists, but they are so willing to be persuaded. And yet the people who argue for international engagement barely lift a finger to persuade them, and they're still there instinctively, right? The opposite, on the other side, the isolationists, particularly on the right, are talking about it all the time, focusing on it all the time.
And can't make a sale.
And the American people aren't buying their arguments, and the Republican Party isn't buying their arguments. They're making some incremental progress in convincing Republicans that maybe we shouldn't be so involved in Ukraine, but they're still a minority, despite the fact that they're talking about it all the time, and the people on the other side are not. And the president is not talking about it and making the case. So I just find it heartening that the American people have a really good inner gyroscope. They're right there, and if only we could get a leader who would go to them and make the case, not just for helping Ukraine, but being stronger in defending Taiwan, being stronger in defending our allies around the world, leading on the world stage, spending more money on defense. Democracy, freedom.
Yeah.
So it's just,
we're
a great leader away from re-energizing the Republican internationalism.
Good. Well, you keep saying that because I'm, one shitty leader away from leaping off some edge. But enough about us. Let's talk about our guest for a second. Roger Zakheim, very good, very old friend to both me and to Mark. He's the Washington director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. He previously practiced law at Covington and Burling, where he led the firm's public policy and government affairs practice group. Before that, he was general counsel and deputy staff director of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee, where he led very capably the passage of their defense authorization bills that are so important. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Before that,
here's our interview. Roger, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here with the Jesse Helms alums.
Well, we're so happy to have you. So you guys have some new polling out that is actually good news when it comes to Ukraine, where we keep hearing that support is faltering, support is weakening, especially among Republicans. What does your polling say?
Yeah, this is our Reagan summer survey. We're in the field towards the end of June, beginning of July. And it's what you said. It's good news. Over 75% of Americans see that it's in the U.S. national interest to have Ukraine win. And that includes a boatload of Republicans, too. And then when you get to funding, which I'm sure you want to talk about, obviously came up in the recent defense authorization bill, Republicans want to continue funding Ukraine. They think it's worth the cost, and that's the majority of Republicans, and has held steady, Mark. That's the key piece. It hasn't declined like the prevailing narrative on the left and right would want you to believe. Actually, consistently, Republicans, the majority of Republicans want to continue supporting Ukraine with platforms with security assistance.
So what's remarkable about that to me is that the American people think that it's in our national interest to support Ukraine, yet no one has made the case to them that it's in our national interest. They seem to know this instinctively and understand it. You know, my old boss, Don Rumsfeld, your dad's old boss, he used to say Americans have a pretty good inner gyroscope, right? You know, the inner gyroscope seems to be pretty good on this, because imagine how it would be if someone actually made the case from a national security perspective.
Well, some are doing it. You know, this podcast, your piece in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal has been great on this. But, you know, to your point, we don't have a president getting out there making the case. Our Speaker of the House has a very delicate majority, so he's not positioned to do this. You know, Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, is very active, as you both know, making the case. But, you know, at the end of the day, this involves the commander-in-chief. That's where Americans should look to figure out what our priorities are when it comes to national security and foreign policy. And, you know, President Biden hasn't prioritized making the case to the American people.
So I'm amazed by the fact that we constantly come back to this, because I wrote a piece in which I counted down the number of times that presidents of the United States, Democrats and Republicans, had given speeches about major national security issues. And no surprise to any of us, that number has declined dramatically since Ronald Reagan, year on year, president on president. And yet, notwithstanding the fact that Mark managed to squeeze in a reference to Don Rumsfeld in the first 3 minutes of our discussion, I am impressed, because it's not like we're living in a vacuum, right? We are actually living in a moment where, yes, there are people who are making the case. As you said, Mark had a wonderful piece. There are others who have been terrific, the Journal, Mitch McConnell, and others. And yet, what we see is that supermajorities believe it's important that we win this war. You're a big part of Reagan's legacy in America. You're a big part of working on that legacy. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think Ukraine's done well. And we just got to start with the fact that Ukraine has been successful. They've repelled the Russian attack. We were all watching in February of 2022 when that convoy lined up, and the prediction was the Russians were going to get to Kyiv. It did not happen. They repelled the attack. So I think that's one thing. Americans like a winner. Number two, Americans want to be on the side of good. They can see the difference between good and evil. And here, there's no question who's right and who's wrong here. Vladimir Putin's evil. What he's doing in Ukraine is evil, and Americans don't really equivocate on these matters. So I think those are the two fundamental reasons why Americans are lining up in the way we're discussing. You know, it's interesting, Danny. Reagan, even when he was in the White House, and a key piece of his legacy, and in part it informs why we do this survey here at the Reagan Institute, really felt it was important to take it to the American people, particularly on issues that perhaps at the time polling suggested the American people weren't behind him. And anything about Reykjavik and arms control and things like that, he took it to the American people. When you make the case, they come around. You know, it's pretty significant that we're seeing these numbers because the prevailing narrative in the media, whether it's MSNBC, Fox, you know, certainly what you see in social media, you know, you both are fighting it every day. I follow your feeds. You get people trying to leave the impression that somehow the American people, and particularly conservatives and Republicans, are not behind Ukraine. They don't want to do this. And that's anything but the case. And the recent House votes, which we should talk about on this matter, and the votes in the Defense Authorization Act, those amendments, actually outperform what we saw in the Reagan survey. In other words, the House of Representatives, Republicans, outperformed the numbers that we saw, what I thought was a very good Reagan defense survey.
So, and what I found was interesting was the reasons why people say we should oppose aid to Ukraine and the reasons why they say we should support it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. Oftentimes you hear that, well, we should oppose it because, you know, we can't account for the funding, right? And so if we were to only audit the funding we give to Ukraine, perhaps that would move people. And that, is a kind of a thread you see in the congressional debate and often you see articulated by Ukraine skeptics. No doubt Ukraine has had its struggles with corruption, so it makes sense people would be looking there. It actually doesn't move the needle at all in terms of making people who support, less supportive in the opposite direction. But here's the kicker, Mark, and we've talked about this before, which I think is amazing, and it goes to the point about making the case. For Republicans who think it's not worth the cost, right? There are about 41% of Republicans who said it's not worth the cost. If you give them three pieces of information, okay, and it's amazing. Here's the three. Ukraine holds 83% of their territory. We've degraded the Russian military. And oh, by the way, the total amount of platforms and goods we've given Ukraine amounts to roughly 3% of 1 year's defense budget. You give them those three pieces of information, and there's an 18-point swing for those who don't think it's worth the cost. Now they move over to the side that think it is worth the cost. And that, to me, is incredible. It means 41% go up to way over 50%.
Amazing how actually making the case moves numbers.
That's the funny thing about people's faith in democracy is that even as they dislike our leaders, even though they dislike our choices, even though they have more and more doubts about the institutions of our government, the reality is that when their leaders, whoever they are, Democrats or Republicans, when their leaders make the case to them, they're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think that's I think that's one of the most heartening things ever.
Before you leave that, the one other thing that I thought was interesting when you go into the reasons to support, like you were saying, corruption doesn't move the needle in opposition. Depleting U.S. weapons stockpile was only 11%. Don't risk provoking Russia, that was 15%. That really doesn't move the needle on opposition. Interestingly, a lot of the practical arguments didn't move the needle when it comes to why to support. Like, degrading Russian military power wasn't that big a number. Sending a message to other countries like China, not a big deal. What were the two biggest reasons? Standing up to Russian aggression and helping protect the freedom and people and sovereignty in countries wherever we can. That together was 67% of the reason to support it. I mean, Americans, they're practical, but they're idealistic too. They know we need to stand up to Russian aggression. They know we need to stand up for freedom. Our country, it's not transactional for Americans. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there's no doubt that this polling reveals, and we've seen it elsewhere in work we've done on this, that the American people believe freedom is a good thing. And they recognize it's in our national interest. Not only is it, it's idealism in some respects, but I think it's also pragmatic. That they understand that we're better off as a country, our freedom, our prosperity, our security, if there are free countries, and if we're opposing those and certainly supporting those who are fighting for their freedom. And I think that bears out here. And truly, elsewhere in the poll, we talk about whether or not international engagement is something Americans support. And if you put it to the American people in the terms of, hey, this is good for our national defense, it's good for our security, economic prosperity, they'll back international engagement every time, approaching, over 80%. So I think it lines up, Mark, both in terms of the narrow discussion of Ukraine more broadly about how Americans look at the world.
So where I was going with my question...
Before you were so rudely interrupted.
Before I was so rudely interrupted, that's also true, is... you've been in this business and you're in the business of furthering Reagan's legacy. I have to be honest with you, and I think I've said this in a bunch of interviews. I've sat with Biden White House officials and said exactly what we've just said. We're with you. We need to do more. Where's the president? Where's the address from the Oval? Now, where's the address to any of the national war colleges? Where's the address to the military? Where is the president using his most unique bully pulpit to make this case? Do you have an understanding or a theory as to why it is that our presidents don't want to make the case for a stand-up American foreign policy?
Danny, I have two thoughts on it, not in any way validated by data or kind of some unique insight from someone who sits in the Situation Room or outside the Oval
Don't worry,
Office.
you're sitting here with Mark. Data has nothing to do with what we talk about.
Take it for what it's worth, right? It's just, but To me, it's one of two things, right? It's a political liability in their mind. It takes them off their message. This is the party that, denigrated the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, as endless wars, and they don't want to be in any way outmaneuvered from holding that position. Or possibly it's an and. Listen, this is not something that President Biden's good at. I don't see him making many speeches. And, whether it's a foreign policy issue of consequence or a domestic policy issue of consequence, this is not the president who's getting out there and bringing it to the American people. If there was a time where Joe Biden was a great communicator and can engage with voters and make the case on TV, it seems to have passed him by, and that's not where they're investing their time, and it's risky. But, I'd add one other thing here, because to contradict myself on that second theory of the case, it's not like the Secretary of Defense is doing this either. You would think that if this is something that the president doesn't want to do, there's a political risk here, but they're still invested in this, that you would have the Secretary of Defense in the context of the first and most consequential war on the continent of Europe since World War II. He'd be out there making the case. That's not what they're doing either. So either they don't feel they have the right messenger, or they think this message is one that they want to bring to their voters, to their base.
That's really important. I actually hadn't thought about the fact that our Secretary of Defense has been almost entirely silent.
Now, he's doing good work, as both of you are aware, going out there and working with the NATO allies and engaging, trying to get the aid synchronized and getting support. So there's kind of stuff that he could point to that he's doing. But on the public affairs side, that hasn't been his role, broadly speaking, as Secretary of Defense, and certainly not one that he's leaned into on Ukraine.
So let's talk a little bit about this. We just had this NATO summit, and we did a podcast with Kurt Volker about sort of the failure on NATO. But there was a poll from the New Europe Center which found that 59% of Americans want to bring Ukraine into NATO, 8% are opposed, and 33% are not sure. That 59% is pretty significant. And what's interesting, they were asked, do you want to invite NATO to become a member as soon as possible, even if the war with Russia is ongoing? 31%. Invite them to become a NATO member, but actual accession happen after the war? 15%. Wait for an invitation until after the war with Russia is over? 13%. I mean, those are pretty stunning numbers when it comes to support for bringing Ukraine into NATO. Why do you think Biden is so reluctant on this?
I'm surprised by the numbers and Americans, but I generally think that if they are supportive of Ukraine and they want to see Ukraine win, which we've discussed about, 3/4 of American people do, then they're really not going to parse, hey, what's the difference between us supporting Ukraine, giving them platforms, and them, becoming a member of NATO. Now, the three of us know there's a big difference, and that's called Article 5, right? And that needs to be taken seriously, and therefore there probably needs to be a more measured policy response. In terms of President Biden, it's, I listened to the last podcast with Volker, and, Ukraine deserved more than they got. And even, there's a way to say no, not right now, that is still encouraging and supportive and kind of gives a shot in the arm to Zelensky, and then the way they were treated. I am fascinated by Henry Kissinger, not someone I turn to generally for what we should or should not be doing on foreign policy. I know with a bunch of Jesse Helms veterans, I'm in good company. But even Kissinger said they should be part of NATO on account that they are an effective and fully armed fighting force. So, you think about what Ukraine brings to the table, there are a lot of NATO allies that bring far less.
I don't think there's any question. I mean, I think one of the most persuasive cases that Kurt made is, here we are, NATO standing against our most potent enemy on the European continent, Russia, and we haven't got a single foot on the ground. It's only the Ukrainians who don't. And those guys who are fighting so effectively, we don't want them in, because, and when I say we, I don't think that actually represents what Americans think about this. I think that represents what the Biden administration thinks about this. I thought, by the way, in that exact same, I'm making an awkward transition here, but I thought you made a really important point. You had a piece not about Ukraine at all, but a piece about
Cuba,
China and Cuba, but it was the same thing. It was this sense of how to stand up to our enemy, who should stand up to our enemies, and the language that they understand. And I thought you made a really, really effective case that applies not simply in the case of Cuba, but also in the case of Ukraine and in so many others. Lay that out for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. This was one that doing a little bit of research, as I'm wont to do here at the Reagan Institute, on national security foreign policy events during the Reagan administration. And I came upon this chapter, which I was not familiar with, but it has shocking parallels to today, when you had this moment in 1979 where the Senate Intelligence Committee found out that the Soviets had deployed an armored brigade. So basically, this military might on the island of Cuba, less than 100 miles from Florida. And it was clear that the Carter National Security Team was flat-footed. They weren't aware of it. To the extent they were aware of it, they were kind of suppressing it. They didn't know how to respond. But what was interesting, and it lines up with what we were talking about just a moment ago, Carter took this really seriously. He was really concerned. Now, it was a political election year. He knew that Ronald Reagan and conservatives would exploit it, let alone hawkish Democrats in the U.S. Senate were concerned about it. And Carter gave an Oval Office address to the nation, explaining why this wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, that we could deal with this problem. And oh, by the way, let's continue to negotiate arms control and have a strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviets. Not really persuasive in making that case. And people like Senator Jesse Helms, talking about him a lot more today than anticipated, came out against it. And it ultimately was one of the reasons why the SALT II treaty failed. You take that episode and you contrast it with today, and compare it. One, China's following the same playbook, to your point, Danny, right? They are now have a military training facility in Cuba, along with a listening station, by the way, the same facilities the Soviets used, they've just moved into. But second, look at the contrast in Carter's response versus Joe Biden's response, right? There is no Oval Office address to the nation explaining what's happening. It's the opposite from his press team, nothing to see or nothing to discuss. There is alignment between Carter and Biden, which is also interesting, which is, hey, don't worry about the security threat posed at the time, the Soviet Union, today China. We can cooperate our way through it. Let's sign a strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union, or today, let's send John Kerry out to Beijing to negotiate some sort of climate deal. So, that respect, that détente is alive and well, and both Carter and Biden clearly are seeking forms of cooperation more than they're interested in competing against an adversary.
So let's talk a little bit about the state of the Reagan foreign policy vision in the Republican Party, because, as you pointed out, in the House, the members overperformed when it comes to the polling. The majority of Republicans support aid to Ukraine, but about 2/3 of Republican members voted to shoot down amendments from isolationist Republicans on Ukraine aid. But then you've got the presidential candidates. And you've got Donald Trump, he's got a weird position on Ukraine where he's sort of saying, I like Zelensky. He backed me on the perfect phone call. He's a good guy. He could have thrown me under the bus, but I like him. And I'll tell Putin, he said the other day, I'll tell Putin to stop this or else I'm going to double the aid that I give to Zelensky. That was sort of encouraging, but he's going to end it in 24 hours because he's a master negotiator. And all of a sudden, Ron DeSantis' super PAC attacks Trump for being too pro-Ukraine and for wanting to give more aid to Ukraine. And these are the two leading candidates for the Republican presidential nomination. All the guys like Mike Pence, who went to Kyiv and met with Zelensky and are, backing him, are in the single digits. I mean, is that just because foreign policy isn't the big issue here, or is there something going on here with a robust Reaganite foreign policy losing its grip in the Republican presidential field?
Mark, I'm a little disappointed with the question. I really thought it was going to end with "What the hell is going on?" Maybe I didn't.
Literally, I cannot believe you said that. I was about to say, I think what you're trying to say, Mark, is what the hell is going on?
Roger, what the hell is going on?
Listen, this is people making bets on an issue they think matters in a primary. Clearly, right? From Vivek to DeSantis. And Trump, kind of taking his own unique approach, right? Can't alienate anybody in that MAGA lane. And they're all pretty confident the MAGA lane will not punish you for opposing Ukraine and possibly reward you. And I've seen this as well, Mark. We talked about this offline. We had visitors from, local Republican club from out west came to the Reagan Institute, and they wanted to talk Ukraine. That was the first issue they wanted to discuss. So I think party activists are very dialed in on this, and for reasons you guys both know and discuss all the time, right? Why are we protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine when we can't, protect our sovereign borders here at home? That's the sort of thing that really gets the party faithful riled up. But that's where I really look at the House vote as quite interesting, because all those members who voted against the Gates and Marjorie Greene Taylor amendment and voted to support, they're for Ukraine, they also have to think about primaries. They also have to worry about those elements that are going to support a Vivek in the primary or DeSantis. They have to worry about them being, losing their seat over it. And I think they're growing in confidence. And I had a chance just prior to the vote to have my own little survey of talking to about half a dozen members in the Republican conference. And there were a number of them that said, listen, this is the right thing to do. I'll have to explain this vote away for those who I can't convince, but I'll get through it. And so, it's one of these things that for the party activists in the primary, early stage of primary, maybe it advantages you, but as you move out to the general mark, my sense is you're going to modify that viewpoint and give you space to support Ukraine.
Roger, you are, like Mark, a happy warrior, and I appreciate that a lot. The world needs happy warriors. As everybody who's ever listened to this podcast knows, I'm not a happy warrior. And the Reagan term in our recent history, I don't want to go back too far, was transformative, right? We changed the world. America changed the world. America ended a 70-year war. America defeated communism. America did all those things while standing up for freedom and democracy, revitalizing our economy. And what I don't understand, and I mean this, and you obviously, you speak with that hat on your head to these members. What happened? Is it ignorance? Is it just the increasing bitter partisanship? Is it Trump? Or if I may coin our phrase again, what the hell has happened?
I think a couple things. One, our friend Matt Condonetti's done a nice job of profiling the history of the conservative movement and showing in some respects that Reagan was a bit of an aberration. So, I certainly see it the way you do, Danny, and there was a lot that happened during the Reagan administration and years that followed. It was all for the good. But this viewpoint, this neo-isolationist mindset, this idea of being skeptical about what America can do in the world, can accomplish in the world, has a long, rich history in the conservative movement and Republican Party. So that's item one. Item two, in this respect, Iraq and Afghanistan is our generation's Vietnam. It's very clear. The endless war, right, getting mired elsewhere, the fact that we can't win, right, and therefore we're spending this money that needs to be spent at home. I mean, you don't have to be deep in the history during and post-Vietnam to see the same sorts of things, kind of was a prevailing mindset in both the Republican and Democratic Party after the war in Vietnam. And, so it takes leadership. It takes leadership to bring people out of it to see that there's a different pathway that ultimately is beneficial to our security and our economic prosperity. But those people are not polling beyond 10% right now.
But isn't the pathway out the Reagan pathway? I mean, so Reagan came in after Vietnam in the very same moment in history. And I mean, it's been pointed out that he engaged our military less than almost any president before or since. And yet he forged the Reagan Doctrine, which was that we'll help these people fight their own wars of liberation. All they need is our weapons, our training, our aid, our diplomatic support, and we could push back on communism without sending troops everywhere to fight these wars. And that's basically what we're doing, in Ukraine right now. So we're following the Reagan Doctrine. We don't have a leader like Reagan who's doing it boldly. Joe Biden is no Ronald Reagan, but isn't the solution the same to maintain that world leadership?
Yes, I mean, of course, that if I wouldn't have said an enthusiastic yes to that question, I am working in the wrong place. But it's clear, Mark, that we don't have leaders who can confidently stand for that and articulate that, or the ones that are leading, they're the ones they are not leading in the early primary contest here, and that's because I think we haven't anybody stare down the shadow of Iraq and Afghanistan. And just if we go to the history a little bit here, because you raised it, Reagan did that, and it hurt him a little bit, but he did it consistently. And he said, listen, the country let down, Washington let down our troops in Vietnam, but the troops were honorable, right? And we just haven't had anybody make that case on a national stage. It's been too toxic, too soon, and as a result, I think it's exploited. It's just too easy. It's low-hanging fruit, whether you're Donald Trump or you're Barack Obama or Joe Biden.
Who can do that? Let's pretend that we're beyond the 2024 election. We're looking at 2028. We're looking at 2032.
Let's not pretend that, Mark. That'll be awesome. And let's do all our podcasts from now on pretending that 2024 isn't going to happen.
Yes, I endorse that 100%. But who do you like who are young leaders? We got these great leaders in Congress who are as you say, courageous vote. They're going to have to explain to the constituencies, but the right thing to do. Who are the guys in Congress and other places who you are impressed with, who you could see carrying that mantle and the Reagan mantle into the future?
It's people I imagine that you and I and Danny, we engage with and admire and encourage all the time, from Mike Gallagher in the House of Representatives to, Tom Cotton in the Senate. But I actually think that to answer that question, I think something productive is coming out, and it's going to shock you both, all right? Put on your seatbelts. Tucker Carlson's engagement with all the candidates minus Chris Christie. And here's why. Those guys did not kind of shrink, right? Mike Pence, whether you thought he did well or didn't do well, gave it back to Tucker and made the case. Tim Scott, what I've seen of the footage, came back and made the case. So we'll see if it pays off for them or if it keeps them under 10% support. But for me, it was good to see some of these people seeking the nomination push back and counter Tucker Carlson on this very issue.
So you beat me to my exit question. You mentioned Matt Continetti's outstanding book, and we had Matt on to talk about it. It really has influenced a lot of what I've thought and what I've written since. And for me, that's the big question about conservatives in America. Are you hopeful that conservative internationalism in defense of freedom and free markets and free people is actually going to be the future of the Republican Party or not?
I am, because as great as Matt's book is, and it gives you this rich history going back to Coolidge, and of course, what would you expect from an American Enterprise Institute scholar other than a great product? The Republican Party, my takeaway from that book, this kind of neo-isolationist or isolationist mindset was strongest prior to World War II. It continued a little bit afterwards, but it was in decline, and that's because we became the global superpower militarily and economically. And so we have so much at stake and so much to lose in a way that we didn't prior to the Second World War. That hasn't changed. In fact, it's only increased, right? So, it's not the Soviet Union today, but as you both, talk about often, it's China. And we can't afford to back down and put up walls and just simply, fold our arms and just say, okay, what will be, what will be. I mean, one of the interesting kind of nuances that we focus on inside the Beltway is that element that don't like Ukraine, but they like Taiwan. That's kind of the conservative element that somehow, they're catering to the Tucker Carlson mindset. At the same time, they want to be, strong countering Xi's China. In the end of the day,
until there's a war in Taiwan, and then they'll be nowhere to be found.
Couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly where I was headed, Mark. Right. So in the end of the day, that dog won't hunt. They're ultimately, going to return to their roots. But it's one that I think the American people. One of my kind of fascinating threads that comes out when we talk to elected officials is how internationalist America's farmers are, and it plays out in Ukraine as well. Right? I mean, you go to Iowa and you talk to them about their farms and their interests. I mean, they are deeply concerned about international trade. Maybe an obvious thing to say inside the Beltway, but not necessarily something most Americans think about when they talk about the heartland and kind of the rural parts of their country. They care about that trade, and as a result, they care about the peace and prosperity because that ultimately, is what keeps the farm humming.
So my exit question is a bit of a loaded question because of your employer. But how do we keep the Reagan legacy alive? We hear from some corners, got to stop talking about Ronald Reagan. Nobody remembers Ronald Reagan. People, this new generation, they weren't alive during the Cold War. These touchstones don't work. Politicians should stop talking about Ronald Reagan. And I never hear the Democrats stop talking about FDR. And he's been dead a lot longer than Ronald Reagan was. Joe Biden's going to be the next FDR, and everybody knows what that means. Do you agree with me? I'm sure you do, that we need to talk about Reagan more, and that we need to hold up Reagan's example more, and we need to fight for the Reagan vision of the Republican Party more. And I'm assuming you agree with that. How do we do it?
Yeah, 100% agree. That won't come as a shock to anybody here, coming to you live from the Reagan Institute in D.C. But the how is the fascinating, question, and one that spend probably a lot of time thinking about. Two things, and it gets to two elements of the legacy. One, fundamentally, when you talk about keeping a legacy alive, you're talking about ideas, you're talking about principles and values. And so whether you want to, attach those ideas, principles, and values to Reagan, peace through strength, the Reagan doctrine, or, go all the way back to our founding in Hamilton, right? We just need to take those core ideas, values, and principles and the artistry and the work that the American Enterprise Institute does, we're trying to do here, I wish more conservative institutions in D.C. and across the country were doing, is to tailor them and apply them for today's challenges. And the Ukraine one is one that's, easily done, more easily done. And there's a second one on the political plane. So I was just hitting on policy, whether it's free market economics or, peace through strength and national defense, American strength. But there's also the way we go about advancing our party and our interests. And here I'm always amazed and pleased by the reception I get. People tell me we need more Reagan. We need more of Reagan. And that is the elevated nature in which Reagan engaged in his politics. The enemy for Ronald Reagan, as you both know, was unnamed bureaucrats, right? His politics, in the end of the day, was about, big tent. It wasn't about left or right. It was about up or down and trying to bring Republicans along and Democrats. Many of the people who came in and worked in the Reagan administration, you both know, were people who were Democrats that were persuaded by the ideas, principles, and values. It was additive politics, but it was also elevated politics. And that element of Reagan's legacy, we are in desperate need of, not just in the Republican Party, but I think across the political spectrum. And we don't have leaders who know how to do that, and we ought to be looking for those who can. I think Tim Scott probably, of everybody we're seeing right now, is one who's most naturally, authentically does just that.
Amen. Amen to that, and amen to more of it. I really agree with you, and I think it's the point that we need to hit on repeatedly and harder. And I'm happy to hear you like Tim Scott as well. He's a great guy.
We like you, Roger.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming
guys,
on the
real.
podcast.
I'm honored to be with you guys. This is super cool.
We started in the intro talking about how the isolationists are talking about this all the time, pushing, and making so little progress. So here's a Gallup poll which asked Americans, which would you prefer the U.S. do in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? End the war as quickly as possible, even if it means allowing Russia to keep territory as captured from Ukraine, or support Ukraine in reclaiming territory that Russia's captured, even if it results in a more prolonged conflict between the two nations. So in August of last year, 66% of Americans said support Ukraine, and 31% said end the conflict as quickly as possible. In January, that number had slipped to 65% in support of Ukraine, and 31% still ending the conflict as quickly as possible. Now in June, it's 62% support Ukraine, 36%. I mean, that's statistically insignificant changes. The American people are just solid on this, despite the fact that this is going on, despite the fact that it appears to be in some ways a stalemate, despite the fact that there are isolationist voices arguing all the time why it doesn't matter, and they are just solid.
And look, I always feel for our listeners, because there are things that we talk about a lot that are, not necessarily about what you think about first thing in the morning. It's not necessarily about inflation. It's not about how damn hot it is outside. It's not about gross smoke from Canada. And it's not about the price of milk and eggs. At the end of the day, though, the issues that we talk about go to the heart of who the American people are. And that's one of the reasons why I like your citation of these numbers, why I like talking to you, Roger Zakheim, why I think it's really important that we talk to people like Kurt Volker and Yara Trofimov, because at the end of the day, and this is the argument you and I always have with AEI's economists, at the end of the day, if something bad happens, if a foreign country gets invaded, if we are threatened, if NATO is threatened, nobody remembers what the price of milk was on that day. Everybody remembers what we did to stand for freedom, how we stood together, and how we stood with the good people in this world to do the right thing. And that's why
Well, they'll remember the price of milk, because if you think inflation is bad now, imagine what the inflation will be like if we have to go to war over Taiwan. If there's a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, inflation is going to be a lot worse. And oh, by the way, you won't be able to find a semiconductor for you. We'll have no cars, we'll have no computers, we'll have no cell phones. I mean, all these things have downstream implications for all the things that people are thinking about every day.
As our listeners know, Mark, I have made a deep and beautiful spiritual argument about the soul and character of the American people, and you have talked about the fact that it will really suck because you will not be able to get your new iPhone. Both are true, but we, I think, now know who is more deep in this conversation.
Yes, you are definitely deep. What depths you fall into is a different story.
I was waiting. I was watching the steam come out of your ears, trying to think of a comeback to that. Hey, folks, we hope you're having a great summer. If you have ideas, thoughts, reactions, don't hesitate to share them with us. And thanks for listening.
Take care. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.